the sixth Mapping Populism panel hosted by ECPS, where we will be exploring the evolution of populism in Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. Over the course of the last year, we've been hosting panel sessions that bring scholars together to discuss the state of political populism in different regions of Europe. So far, we have done 5 sessions, hosted 25 prominent scholars, and covered Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the Balkan region, as well as Europe's heartland. Our panelists have provided expert insight into the national trends of populist development and far-right movements across Europe. The aim is to have a complete picture of populism in Europe following the conclusion of this panel series. After each session, ECPS publishes a panel report alongside a video recording on its website. And through this, we hope to provide an invaluable source of information, not only for our scholars, but also to a wider audience like policymakers who are concerned about the current challenges to democracy in Europe. Starting in 2023, we will be moving beyond the borders of Europe and expanding this project to include cases of populism around the world. So after this brief explanation, I'm excited to introduce our panelists and moderator for today. I'd like to start with our moderator, Dr. Hans-Georg Betz. Dr. Hans-Georg Betz is a leading expert on radical right populism in liberal democracies and has explored topics of nativism, Islamophobia, and populism in several books, articles, and chapters. After obtaining his PhD in political science at MIT, he went on to teach at several universities, including Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., and New York University in Toronto. Dr. Betz is currently adjunct professor of political science at the University of Zurich. Our first speaker of today is Dr. Paul Karls, who will be exploring the case of Luxembourg through his lecture titled Right-Wing Populism in Luxembourg, an Exception to the Rule. Dr. Paul Karls is currently an independent researcher who recently published his book Multiculturalism and the Nation in Germany, a study in moral conflict this past fall. This research explored the academic debates around Germany's national identity in the face of the 2015 refugee crisis. He previously worked as a researcher for the Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research, and he holds a PhD in political science from the University of Montreal. Our second speaker today is Dr. Benjamin Bière. His presentation, The State of the Far Right in Belgium, a Contrasted Situation, will be focused on the manifestation of populism in Belgium. Dr. Benjamin Bière is a researcher at the Center for Sociopolitical Research and Information and a guest lecturer at the Catholic University of Louvain. His primary research interests include populism, the far right, party politics, and democracy. Our third speaker today is Dr. Carola Schoor, who will be speaking on the state of populism in the Netherlands in her presentation, The Mainstream of Populism in the Netherlands. Dr. Carola Schoor is the program leader of the public affairs at the Center for Professional Learning at Leiden University. In 2020, she defended her dissertation with the title, The Politics of Style, Political Performance Caught Between Populism, Elitism, and Pluralism at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences of Maastricht University. This takes us to our fourth speaker today, Dr. Alina Dolea, who will discuss Switzerland in her presentation titled Populist Discourses in Switzerland. Dr. Alina Dolea is an associate professor in strategic communication and public diplomacy at Bournemouth University in the UK. She holds a PhD in communication sciences, and her research is situated at the intersection of public diplomacy, migration, media, and communication studies with a focus on discourse. She's particularly interested in the role of non-state actors, non-state actors have come to play in public diplomacy, reproducing, but also contesting and disrupting state strategic communications. On behalf of ECPS, I'm looking forward to the interesting insights offered by the panelists and moderator today. Before leaving the floor to Dr. Betz, I'd like to note that while we usually do the Q&A session after the completion of the presentations, today for the presentation of Dr. Karls, our first speaker, we will do it just after his presentation and specific to his topic because he has to leave earlier. For the other speakers, we will hold the Q&A at the end of the panel. You can write your questions in the chat box or raise your virtual hand and pose your questions in person. And on this note, I'd like to hand off the stage to Dr. Betz. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me here. In this introduction, I want to make just a few brief kind of points, particularly why it makes sense to put these different cases together. I'll start out with kind of, I feel nostalgic actually when, when I see this, because when I started doing research from a comparative kind of perspective on these political parties and movements in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I remember going to Brussels. That was the first stop, and going to Maduplein to the Vlaamsblok, and it was called Vlaamsblok at the time, not Vlaamsbelang. And actually climbing up the stairs and talking to these people, and it was actually quite ironic. They didn't speak English, I didn't speak Flemish, so we spoke to each other in French. Given the animosities between the northern part of the country and the southern part of the country, I thought that was quite hilarious. And then I went to Switzerland. And in Switzerland, it was not the Swiss People's Party, which is now the big thing. It was a political party, was called the Autopartei, the Automobilists Party. It's disappeared now. The remnants basically have joined the SVP. The other one basically left, that kind of thing. Certainly in the early 1990s, it did not, I would have never imagined 30 years later, I would still write and talk about these kind of political parties. A lot of people told me, yeah, what's the point? They're going to be gone in a couple of years anyway. Well, they didn't. And I think one of the important things nowadays one has to kind of look into is, I mean, what explains the staying power of these political parties? Some of these parties, I mean, the Vlaamsbelang is one of them, have become part of the establishment. They have been around for 30 years. There is no more established party than these. I mean, the Lega Nord or the Lega now in Italy is the longest still surviving party after the revolution in Italy. Now I want to mention three things why I think what we can learn actually from these particular political parties. I'll start out with the Vlaamsblok. What I learned from the Vlaamsblok is the notion of Eigenvolk eerst, which is central to nativism. And nativism, of course, is now central basically to radical right-wing populism. It's the notion the own people first. Now, this is not a new kind of thing. I mean, it goes back all the way to the late 19th century in France with Les Français d'abord. But really, I mean, whenever I write about nativism and define it, I use this kind of slogan, Eigenvolk eerst, because it perfectly expresses what nativism on the radical right is all about. In the Netherlands, I think what is important and which had a big influence is actually Pim Fortuyn. And Pim Fortuyn, because he was very adamant about defending Western liberal values against what Philip de Winter at one point called the green totalitarianism. And this is with Pim Fortuyn, the notion that we have to defend our culture and our civilization, to kind of mention Rogers Brubaker, who wrote about that recently, became part of the justification of nativism on the radical populist right. Finally, Switzerland. I mean, Switzerland is a very interesting kind of case, because in Switzerland, there's not just one radical right or radical right-wing populist party. There are actually quite a few. The most pronounced, of course, is the Swiss People's Party, the SVP, which at one point actually was a 10% party for 40, 50 years. And then suddenly in the 1990s went from 10% to 30% and beyond within a couple of years. Now, they are not the only one. There is actually in the canton of Ticino, in the Italian-speaking one, is a Lega dei Ticinesi, which is the majority party in the canton. And in Geneva, you get every decade another kind of movement. The latest one was the Mouvement des Citoyens Genevois. What all of these parties have in common is they are fundamentally against their neighbors. The Lega dei Ticinesi is against the Italians, the Mouvement is against the French, and the SVP is against the Germans. Now, but that is not what is important. What's interesting about the Swiss case, what's interesting really about the Swiss case is that it fits very well into what Jensen calls populist mobilization. Because the Swiss parties are not populist. They are ordinary kind of political parties, but which mobilize at certain points of time very, very strongly along these kind of populist lines. This was, and they're using the tool which is available in Italy, which is popular initiatives, citizens' initiatives. The most famous, of course, is the one of 2009, the initiative against the minarets, banning the further construction of minarets in Switzerland, which was adopted by about 57% of those who bothered to vote in that, and actually quite a few people voted in that one. And the other one was were all the initiatives against European membership, membership of Switzerland in the European Union. That was against, started out against the membership in the European Economic Area. And then it was basically against any kind of what they call creeping membership in the European Union. A third kind of point, which is and which is important in this kind of context, and which again, why I think it makes sense to put in the Swiss kind of case, is that, interesting enough, the Vlaamsblok and the SVP in Switzerland have one thing in common, among other, also the anti-Islam kind of doctrines and rhetoric and whatnot. But one thing which is important to have in common, and this is the role in the Second World War. As you know, I mean, the Vlaamsblok actually comes out of groups in the Flemish part of the country who collaborated with the Germans. What is less well known is actually what happened in Switzerland. In the 1990s, there were big attacks against Switzerland because of the question of gold, which were hidden in Switzerland and nobody really thought about it any longer, but also accounts in Swiss banks of Jews who had perished basically during the Holocaust. And there was bigger, and that raised the whole kind of question, I mean, of Switzerland's role during the Second World War. Did the Swiss really kind of behave the way a neutral kind of country should? And it's in this kind of situation that actually Christoph Blocher, who becomes the bigwig out of Zurich of the SVP, gives a bunch of speeches in which he basically says, we played a very honorable role during the Second World War. And that really resonated among a lot of people, among a lot of Swiss, who had this feeling that Switzerland was being kind of attacked left, right, and center, and that was unjustified. And that the funny thing is that actually the SVP comes out of a political party which goes back all the way to the 19th century, and which was part of a party of farmers and small kind of business people. And they were not only in parliament, but also in government. And in the 1940s, during the Second World War, the Minister of Justice, and Switzerland only has 7 portfolios, ministerial portfolios, was a member of that party. And he was responsible for banning any kind of Jewish refuge in Switzerland. He basically shut them out. I mean, you might also know that the Swiss also insisted that German passports have a J in there in order to allow the Swiss authorities to basically kind of throw back Jewish refugees into the country. So that fundamentally, I mean, there's the rise of this, the uprise of, if you want, of the Swiss People Party in the 1990s has a lot to do basically with the role of the Swiss and the guilt a lot of Swiss still feel, the uneasy feelings a lot of people have in this country about their role during the Second World War, and that maybe they did not behave as honorably as one would think. And it was Bloch ultimately who told them, no, you were okay, we are okay, everybody's okay. You know, I mean, it's just a bad kind of East Coast types who are attacking us, and that is totally unjustified. And they've been writing this kind of argument for the last 20 years now, constantly defending the Swiss against their neighbors who they consider to basically looking down upon the Swiss with arrogance and whatnot. And it really has done wonders for a political party, which at one point was the junior partner in government. They only had one seat in government, the others had 2 seats. And now they actually have 2 seats in government. And they hold very important ministerial positions in the country. So that is about as much as I can say about why this might be important beyond, just saying here, I mean, how many votes these parties get and whatnot. That I don't think is all that important. What is important is what they stand for and what they fundamentally basically transport. It's not for nothing that, for example, at one point, I think it's gone now called Cities Against Islamization. Yeah, it was the Dutch, it was the French, it was the Belgians, and it was the Swiss. I mean, Oskar Freisinger, particularly, who is out of Valais, canton next to mine, who was very, very, very vocal in all of these kind of things. All right. So with that, I'll have the rest of the panel say something.
Okay, I guess that means I go now. So let me, let's see, let me get my PowerPoint loaded up. Okay, so you all can see my PowerPoint. Is it, can I get thumbs up from someone?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, good, good. Okay, so my presentation here is about right-wing populism in Luxembourg, and the subtitle is An Exception to the Rule, and I think maybe when I'm finished you'll understand a little bit better why that's an appropriate subtitle. Very briefly, Luxembourg is obviously a very small country. I'm not sure if the country itself attracts a lot of research attention, and specifically right-wing populism is rather not a very well-researched topic for Luxembourg. There are a few notable texts. I've listed them here in case anyone else is interested. There's a book by Lucien Blau, which, as far as I can tell, is only available in Luxembourg, about the extreme right in Luxembourg, a history of the extreme right in the 20th century. There's also very recently a book published by Léonie de Jong about the Benelux countries, including Luxembourg, so right-wing populism there. I just published an article last year about right-wing populism in Luxembourg. And also in 2012, Philippe Poirier, he's a researcher at the University of Luxembourg, and he also has published some work on the ADR. And this text here is sort of a history of the ADR up until 2012 at least. So, while I'm talking about the ADR, what is the ADR? The ADR is the Alternative Demokratische Reformspartei, or in English, the Alternative Democratic Reform Party. It was founded in 1987 as a single issue pension reform party. And in the 1990s, it gained more and more success, and eventually the party, or the Luxembourg, adopted essentially all of the reforms of the pension scheme that they wanted. And so the party became, well, it expanded basically to incorporate a number of different topics to become sort of a full-fledged party. So by 2006, they had achieved that transformation. In the last elections, in 2018, they received 8.3% of the vote. So they have a few seats. They have 4 seats in the Luxembourgish parliament out of 32, or I'm not sure exactly how many there are, but They have 4 seats in the parliament. I believe there's 60 seats. And when you look at Luxembourg, the ADR is really the only, it's really the only party in Luxembourg that has a right-wing populist profile. There's really not any meaningful right-wing extremist political parties or movements to speak of. And even the ADR, to say that they're right-wing populist is a little problematic, and I'll explain why. But if you're going to come to Luxembourg, and if you're looking for right-wing populism, it will be the ADR. That is the party basically that you're going to be looking at. And when I call the ADR right-wing populist, it's important to note that, at least as far as I can tell, there are at least 2 meanings of the term right-wing populist. And the one that I think applies to a lot of countries and that is used very frequently in the secondary literature and also in the popular realm in newspapers and things like that. When people speak of right-wing populism, they mean essentially a proto-fascistic movement that undermines democracy, that is racist and xenophobic, and has authoritarian tendencies. So that's one meaning of right-wing populism. There's also, I guess what you could say is a literal definition of right-wing populism. And that's where what I mean when I say that is you basically look at the literal definition of populism, which is a political party or group that makes a distinction between the people and the elites. So that's the basic definition of populism, is a discourse that separates the elites from the people. And that certainly fits the ADR. In their discourse, they very much do distinguish, they identify a set of elites, and they distinguish those elites from the people. And the ADR is also right-wing. What I mean by that is they defend conservative positions generally. And they're Eurosceptic to some extent. They, I guess, are fans of Viktor Orban in Hungary. But they're also very, so they adopt conservative positions, but they're also not, they're not extremist or racist or xenophobic in a conventional sense. They keep their distances, for example, from the AfD in Germany, and they also keep their distances from the Rassemblement National in France. So they're a bit picky in that sense. And what you see when you look at the discourse is sort of the basic features of a right-wing populist party. You have vertical exclusions between the elite and the people, but you also have the horizontal exclusions that you find very often in right-wing parties. And the horizontal distinctions are between the Luxembourgish nation and a series of outgroups. So, for example, Islam is a very prominent feature of critique, and also sort of feminists, multiculturalists. Those would also be sort of horizontal exclusions, I guess. The discourse of the ADR is very much right-wing populist, but I would say in a very literal sense and not in a sort of conventional or proto-fascistic sense. And I don't, the ADR is not a party that is actively seeking to undermine democracy in Luxembourg or anything like that. And so I wanted to show a couple examples of the discourse that the ADR produces in order to demonstrate what I mean. And this is an example from Gast Geberian. He's a member of parliament from the ADR in 2015. And in 2015, there was a very important constitutional reform that was, it wasn't instigated by the ADR, but rather it was instigated by the ruling, I guess you'd call it the Red Light Coalition at the time. It was a coalition between the Liberal Party, the Green, and the Socialist Party. And they were ruling the country, and they wanted to institute a reform of the constitution to allow foreign residents to vote in national elections. So those who were living in Luxembourg, who are not Luxembourgish, who do not have a Luxembourgish passport, they wanted to allow those individuals to vote in national elections for the Luxembourgish parliament. And there was this big campaign. It was a very big issue in 2015. The ADR was the only party that was opposed to reforming the constitution in that sense. Every other party essentially was in favor of the reform. The CSV, which is sort of the CDU of Germany, of Luxembourg, I'm sorry. The CSV is the CDU of Luxembourg. They had sort of a nuanced position, but they did not give a definitive no. So the ADR was the only party that said definitively no, and the results of the referendum were quite clear. Actually, I think something like 87% of the population voted against the reforming the constitution in that sense to give foreign citizens the right to vote. There are of course a couple other measures on the ballot, but that was the most important one. And so the day after, or very soon after the referendum, Gasparian gave a speech in the parliament, and this is what he said. But power hungry as the government is, it sticks to its guns. The trust of the citizens in them has eroded. From June 7th on, it will no longer be the government for the people, which uses the Luxembourgish term Volk, which is very close to the German Volk, but the government against the people. And so here, this is a very clear example of the kind of vertical exclusions or vertical demarcations in the ADR's discourse. You have the elites, you have power-hungry elites who are opposed to the people. And here it's very clear, it is a government against the people. Well, when 87% of the population votes against a certain measure, maybe there is some justification in making the claim, but in any case, this is a very good example of the vertical and vertical exclusion that it's very clear. This is a very populistic expression. Another quote, this one is from Fernand Kartheiser. He's also a member of parliament at the time of the ADR. And this is in response to the proposed passage of a burqa law that would outlaw the wearing of the burqa in the public sphere in Luxembourg. There have been similar laws passed in Belgium and in France. And so the ADR was hoping to have a similar law passed in Luxembourg. And so there was a debate that lasted about 4 years. And finally, it came to an end. They passed a law that that banned the burqa in public spaces, such as public administrations, buses, and things like that, I think. But this is a quote from Fernand Kartheiser, where he discusses the burqa, the law, and how it fits in with Luxembourgish society. And so he says, we do not want to succumb step by step to demands that are foreign to our culture, that do not correspond to our Judeo-Christian civilization, our humanistic heritage. We are not giving up our civilization and the values that make up our culture to succumb to the pressure of various radical elements here. We want to preserve the society as it is, as the CSV said, the social contract and the culture that we have, that remains. And people who come here should align with that, with our values, and not the other way around. So in this quote, it's very clear, if you're familiar with Rogers Brubaker and the idea of civilizationalism, there is quite a bit, it has very strong civilizational elements that would align the ADR with other right-wing populist parties in Europe. At the same time, in the same speech, here in the second quote, Fretan Kartheiser also said that there was a need for immigrants to integrate into a society that is multicultural, in the sense that many different cultures are found here. And so that's sort of the unique aspect of the ADR's discourse, and that sets it apart from, I think, most other right-wing populist parties in Europe, is that they embrace immigration, they embrace multiculturalism, or at least a version of multiculturalism. You can look throughout their discourse. You can, in my article, analyze this in more detail, but it's very much a party that it does not exhibit very strong xenophobic tendencies, but it does still, as you can see in the first quote there, it does still contain these horizontal exclusions that you find that is typical of right-wing populist parties across Europe. So they are right-wing, they are populist, but there's at the same time, they're still somewhat unique in their embrace of multiculturalism and immigration. So how can we explain that? And this is my last slide. How can we explain this unique feature of right-wing populism in Luxembourg? How can we have a right-wing populist party that embraces immigration and multiculturalism? This seems to be a contradiction. To explain, I think it's important to look at Luxembourg's socioeconomic structures. And the first thing that is important to note is that Luxembourgers have a very special status in the country. They have very high wages, and many of them work in government or civil service jobs. And these are jobs that are reserved for people who speak Luxembourgish. So the language is a barrier to entry for these jobs, these very well-paying jobs. And that's sort of a way to keep these well-paying jobs to Luxembourgers themselves. A lot of the foreign and commuter labor, and Luxembourg is also, it's a very small country, but it also has a lot of foreign labor coming into the country every day. Almost half of the country, half of the country's workforce comes from these commuters who live in France, Belgium, or Germany, who commute to Luxembourg every day. And they do much of the manual labor. So there are also lots of Portuguese who come and who live here, and they work in construction, they work in the service industry, and they have sort of the low-paying jobs, the lower-paying jobs, I guess. And so that creates the Luxembourgish people as sort of, you could say, a privileged elite with a special status. And so you have the Luxembourgers as a nation, I guess you could say, that benefits very greatly from the influx of immigration, of cross-border workers, from this sort of multicultural society that they have established here in Luxembourg. And they also, and that's why it would be very difficult for any party in Luxembourg to be very strongly opposed to immigration or multiculturalism in the sense that you find perhaps with the AfD in Germany. Because a party that has strong stances on issues like that would not fare very well electorally. So, and another important point, I guess, is that the language is also very important for the ADR. And the ADR is very strong on protecting the Luxembourgish language, protecting the status of Luxembourgish for entry into civil service jobs. So there's kind of, right, so the Luxembourgish people, it's very unique. They are themselves an elite that is protected. So typically when you think of populism, you think of the elite and the people, but the Luxembourgish people are themselves an elite. They also benefit greatly from multiculturalism, and so these are perhaps some of the reasons why the ADR is what it is, and why it has to be what it is. I guess it defends right-wing positions, defending the population, the Volk, with the language, for example, but at the same time it embraces multiculturalism and sort of an open, fluid economy. So that's my presentation. So. So I guess I'm not sure who's moderating. Should I take the questions or?
Hi, thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead,
Is it
please.
or-
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. Would anyone in the audience have any questions? Or you can type them in the chat if you're more comfortable that way. I know it's a bit quick. Usually people have a bit more time to think things over as they hear the different presentations.
I saw Bulent had his hand up, I think.
Oh,
Yeah, Paul.
Yes,
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Actually, Luxembourg is a very small nation, and actually, sometimes that country couldn't be catch on the radar. Generally, people are familiar with the populist radical right movements or other populist movements in bigger nations. But I wonder how the mechanism of populism or radical right functions in such a small nation. When we look at India or other crowded populations, we could easily find some traces, but could you see any difference of these mechanisms of radical right or extreme right or far right in such a small amount of population?
I don't know, could you maybe rephrase the question? I'm not sure if I understand. What do you mean by mechanisms?
I mean, you know, there are some big groups like Hindus against Muslims, or Swedish against non-Swedish.
Right.
And this volume of people may be counted as millions, hundreds of millions in Indian case. How it functions in Luxembourg?
Okay, right. So in Luxembourg, the country itself has, I think, about 650,000 people living in it. About half of that are Luxembourgers, so people with a Luxembourgish passport. And Luxembourg also has a very long history of immigration. It incorporated Yugoslavs after World War II. Also after World War II, there was a wave of Portuguese immigration. And the ADR has, in its discourse, noted that and has spoken very favorably of that. So I guess I guess what you mean is there a Luxembourgish population that is set up against some other group? And that's where, like I said, it's very difficult to find a very hard juxtaposition in that sense that you would find in maybe another country, just because in Luxembourg everything is so fluid. There's so many people every day coming into the country. There's this history of immigration. It's a very transnational country in a lot of different ways, also economically, socio-politically. And so, as I mentioned, I think it would be very difficult for any kind of party to come in and make a very hard juxtaposition between a native group and other groups of foreign entities coming in. So you don't really have that so much in Luxembourg.
I see Dr. Schoot has her hand up if you'd like to ask a question.
Yes, hello, Paul. I have a question about the policy of the government to, like, the eigen volk eerst policy. You could tell that. has it been always like that, or is that like new or something from more recent times?
Yeah, I'm not really sure too much about the detailed history of Luxembourgish politics. I know that I think the country didn't even exist until maybe the late 19th century, early 20th century, somewhat similar to Germany. And sort of a national consciousness raising only happened relatively late compared to other countries. So it happened maybe in the 20th century only.
Okay.
So I would say, and this also sort of touches again with what Boulan asked, is the language is really the vector of, I guess you'd say, the nation. So if there is an opposition between the people, the Luxembourgish people, and other groups, it's not made on ethnic or religious grounds. It's made on linguistic grounds. So they want to defend the Luxembourgish language, and as I mentioned, it's as a barrier of entry to these well-paying government jobs, and that's if you want, that is where the eigene Volk zuerst, that's where that would come in. Is we have to protect the Luxembourgish people by making sure that they can have really well-paid jobs. And how do we do that? We have to do that by making sure that Luxembourgish as a language has a very respected status in the civil bureaucracy. So,
yeah, thank you.
I think we have one last question in the chat. I'll just read it out. Firstly, he thanks you for your presentation. And he asks, if we consider the three features drawn by Mude of populist radical right parties, nativism, populism, and authoritarianism, do you think the populist radical right from Luxembourg meet these requirements? If not, as I can extract from your presentation, do you think that the populist radical right from Luxembourg should take on a different categorization/name?
right. So again, I don't think that the ADR qualifies as a radical right party. That's why I made that distinction between the proto-fascistic understanding of right-wing populism and the literal definition of right-wing populism. And I'm not the only one. There's very few. In my article, I discuss a little bit the research. There are other people who have discussed the ADR, and there's no consensus that it is a right-wing populist party, due precisely to this this question of understanding. Because when people say right-wing populist, they oftentimes mean proto-fascistic, but the ADR is not proto-fascistic. So but it is literally a right-wing populist party. So it makes it very difficult to classify. And yeah, I'm not sure. I wouldn't classify it as a right-wing radical party, but it is right-wing populist. So yeah, it's just one of those things, I guess.
I think we have one last question because otherwise we need to move on to the next presentation. But I see there's a hand raised by Fatih Burmesh, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, please. Thank you very much indeed. Well, my question, I put it in I put my concern in the chat box, but I would like to see with the last presenter. I'm sorry, I missed some of the my presentations before, but my concern is that populism or radicalism, or you see, this nativist attitudes are. Can you hear me? Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay. They are widespread. I mean, in countries which have adopted multiculturalism for a while now. So how can you explain this? I mean, it is a bit contradictory, isn't it?
Well,
thank you.
Yeah, I guess in answering that question, I would maybe say you can read my book about Germany, Multiculturalism and the Nation in Germany, a study in moral conflict. And what you often have is you have governments who are in control, certain ruling parties that are in control, and they officially adopt a policy of multiculturalism, like in Australia or France or Canada. So you have an official government policy of multiculturalism, but at the same time, there's always a segment of the population that does not agree, that contests that that certain policy, and that creates conflict, moral conflict, I would say. And so there's always the official policy can be one thing, but that doesn't mean that it's universally embraced by the entire population. And so these right-wing populist parties come in, and they're the ones who are contesting these policies, and that creates conflict. So that would be my answer, I guess.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Carl, Dr. Carl, sorry.
Yes.
And I think
Thank
we'll
you.
gladly move on to.
Yes, okay.
Sorry.
Yes, goodbye,
Thank you
everyone.
for joining us.
Yes, thank you for the invitation.
We'll now move on to an analysis of Belgium by Dr. Bier. We'll also do questions at the end, I believe, because Dr. Bier will also be short on time. So please keep that in mind as you listen to his presentation.
Yes, hi everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me for this panel. And I'm sorry for having to leave 20 minutes before, but I have to catch up a train for another meeting in the end of the afternoon. So in my speech, I would like to analyze the state of the far right in Belgium. Although fascinating, the situation is not so simple to analyze, since contrary to most of federal states, the Belgian party system is divided on a communitarian basis, and there is no organized or almost no organized party at the national level, contrary to most other federal states. And in this context, Belgium is facing a contrasting or paradoxical situation. In fact, while far-right party dominates the political game in Flanders, in the north of the country, the Vlaams Belang, as said Hans-Georg, I will come back to that in a few minutes, of course. Far-right is completely marginal in the rest of the country. Yet neither in Flanders nor in Wallonia or in the rest of the country, Brussels or the German-speaking part of the country, has the far-right been in power over time in Belgium. So this is a specificity compared to other cases in Europe. In the next few minutes, I will come back to the situation that prevails in Belgium, and I will try to provide some keys in order to understand this paradox, why there is a very strong radical right or far right party in Flanders and no relevant far-right party in the rest of the country. I will also question some institutionalized mechanisms, such as the cordon sanitaire, which is a real Belgian reality for almost 3 decades for the moment. And I will try to better apprehend their effects, both on the development of far-right organizations, but also on the circulation of their ideas. But first of all, let me clarify the use of the notion of far-right. As suggested by Andrea Pirot in a very recent article published in Nations and Nationalism this year, a few months ago, the notion of far-right is an umbrella concept that captures both populist, radical right and extremist variants of right-wing politics. Following the order, the main difference between these two variants is their stance towards democracy, while populist radical right challenges the very liberal foundations of democracy, such as the balance of power, for example, or the rights granted to different kind of minorities. Extreme right rejects the constitutional order outright and aim at subverting the democratic statu quo. Therefore, I propose to retain the notion of far right in the rest of my presentation in order to encompass these different sensibilities. So what about far right in Flanders? I have to share my screen, I think. I just have a few slides, not a lot. I think you can see it for the moment. Oof. How could I do? Yeah. Oof. As already underlined, the situation is quite positive, I would say, for the far right in that part of the country, in Flanders, particularly for the Vlaams Belang. Founded in 1979 by Karel Dielen under the name Vlaams Blok, that period, as underlined by Hans-Georg a few minutes ago. That party was originally a separatist and still a separatist organization, Flemish separatism, that quickly became a far-right party, notably under the leadership of Philippe de Winter and under the inspiration of the French National Front. Is that slogan, Eigen volk eerst, our own people first, that was directly linked to the slogan by Jean-Marie Le Pen and the National Front at that period in France. His first real electoral success at the national level came in 1991. At that level. At that moment, the party reached and passed the symbolic threshold of 10%. You can see it on the graph just on the screen. By the way, even today, we speak about Black Sunday to describe, to qualify this election. So that election really marked the everybody in the country and even beyond because of the results by the far right at that period. And in the years that followed until the mid 2000s, the party experienced increasing electoral successes, as you can see it again in front of you. So when you have a C, it's the federal elections. When you have an R, it's the regional elections, just to be sure that we understand the graph in the same way. In 2004, the party changed its name after being convicted in court for hate speech. The Vlaams Blok became the Vlaams Belang. However, it should be noted that the party has not really changed itself. The leaders themselves recognized that operation was mostly an operation aiming at changing the name, but not the real program or the leaders of the party. Then you can see a real significant electoral backlash for nearly, I would say, more than a decade. And then the Vlaams Belang succeeds in regaining its status of major party, becoming the second party of the country in 2019. Now, for the past 3 years, the Vlaams Belang has been the leading party in the vast majority of polls. And because of the so-called cordon sanitaire, so an agreement in order to exclude far-right parties from exercising power, the Vlaams Belang remains in opposition everywhere from the local level to the federal national level, which is quite exceptional, I think, in light of its electoral results over time, and specifically again in 2019. Yet, in my previous research, I have demonstrated that the Vlaams Belang is nevertheless influential, even from the opposition and with that specific status. That influence is indirectly exercised on public policies, mostly at the agenda setting stage of the policy-making process, but also when it comes to adopting some decisions, very specifically. That influence can also be exercised beyond. And most of the time we forget that specific way such far-right parties may exercise an influence, for example, by joining the board of directors of several public structures, such as the Flemish TV channel VRT. There are some people from Vlaams Belang in that board of directors, and they can influence not directly public policies, but decisions adopted by that TV channel, which is also very important. In the rest of the country, many far-right parties try to emerge, but cannot structure themselves and remain absolutely marginal. I have here a graph about Wallonia. You can see that the real maximum on that graph is 10%, and these results count for all the far-right parties that are developing together. So it's very marginal. Nevertheless, one of the far-right parties that has developed the most since the 80s is undoubtedly that party, the National Front, the Belgian National Front, of course, but you can see there are some links even through that logo directly linked to the National Front in France of Jean-Marie Le Pen at that period. Without becoming a real major political force, the National Front has obtained several seats in various parliamentary assemblies at the local level, regional level, federal level, and even at the European Parliament over time. But in 2012, it was condemned following a lawsuit brought by Marine Le Pen and banned it from using the name, acronym, and emblem of the National Front. Consequently, the party simply disappeared. But it's of course not, maybe it was the most important recent historical point of view. Far-right parties are other far-right parties that are trying to develop, and another one is that one, the party Nation, that was created in 1999. That party still exists today, but we have to say that it has accumulated electoral failures. That's also why the party presents itself not specifically as a political party, but as a movement more than a party, in the sense that it places militant activism at the heart of its action. And you can see here on the PowerPoint an action by the militants, some dozens, there are not very much of them, of Nation. They are going into a halal restaurants with these pigs masks in order to provoke some people. That's the best way, the most important ways they use in order to diffuse, to dilute their own political message. At his last Congress in September this year, 2 months ago, the party gathered only about 30 members. So it's the maximum they could gather this year. So it's a very marginal organization, still existing for more than 20 years now, but we have to admit that it's a very marginal political party. The case of Nation is interesting because it's, I would say, the oldest far-right party in Wallonia, still present today in that part of the country, but still other far-right parties have tried to develop in Belgium over time, such as the Parti Populaire, but disappeared over time. The last far-right party that having been created, I would say, in Wallonia is that party, Chez Nous, founded, so it's at home translation, founded last year in October 2021 by two of the ex-members of the Parti Populaire, another disappeared far-right party in that part of the country. That party has not yet participated in election, but that party, Chez Nous, remains marginal for the moment. Maybe it could change. You can see on that photo on the far left, Tom van Grieken, the leader of the Vlaams Belang, the Flemish Vlaams Belang, and in the middle, maybe, of course, you will have recognized Jordan Bardella, the new party leader of the national, of the French Rassemblement National, national rally. So he can get, and yes, the support of Geert Wilders from the Netherlands too since then. So he can count on strong support beyond the national or the linguistic regional borders of Belgium. But I will come back to that party and the difficulties it faced in a few minutes. So in a nutshell, far-right parties have been struggling to develop in French-speaking Belgium for several decades, but systematically failed in becoming a relevant party family in that part of the country. So the question we can now ask is, why such a paradoxical situation? First, if we look at the demand side, it doesn't really help us to understand the weakness of the far right in that part of the country, since opinion polls showed that the attitudes of citizens towards immigration are broadly the same in Flanders and in Wallonia. There's an exception maybe for Brussels, but let's focus on Flanders and Wallonia. For instance, Flemish and Walloon think that immigration increases the problem of insecurity in similar proportions. They also think that immigration increases an employment problem for the natives in similar proportions. So in terms of attitudes regarding or towards immigration, there is no fundamental difference between citizens in Flanders and in Wallonia. This means that the electoral demand is very present and that we have to look elsewhere, especially on the supply side, in order to try to better understand that paradox. So let me present the most important factors in my view. The very first one is related, I would say, to the traditional divisions of the far right in the French-speaking part of Belgium, which are reflected in numerous splits. For instance, the Belgian National Front, you still have the logo in front of you on the slide, that was founded in 1985 and that was existing until 2010, experienced dozens of splits. For the size of the region, it's very, very important in terms of number. It's still the case today for other far-right parties. For example, 3 years ago, a new party called Parti National Européen, the European National Party, was created by former members of the far-right party Nation, that party I was talking a few minutes ago, and with these pigs masks on the screen. These divisions reduce, of course, the visibility of far-right parties, but also discredit these parties that are recognized as more a gang of funny people more than real politicians, I would say. In contrast, and for the moment, the Flemish far right remains united. And I insist, for the moment, it has been different still 10 years ago, but still united around Vlaams Belang. So it's a very first point, very important to understand why there's such a paradox in Belgium between the Flanders and Wallonia regarding the situation of the far right. Second, there is no charismatic leader able to mobilize crowds in French-speaking Belgium, contrary to the situation that prevails in Flanders, for example, with Philippe de Winter, that has never shared the party, but who is recognized as the historic leader of the Vlaams Blok and Vlaams Belang, or today, you still have that guy on the screen, Tom van Grieken, who is pretty charismatic, I would say. Of course, this factor may evolve over time. We can may evolve quite quickly. We will see in the future, but it's a second explanation for such a paradox.
2 more minutes, by the way, just timekeeping, 2 more minutes that we have for the presentation.
Okay, I will try to do quickly. Then the strategies of struggle developed by civil society also differ. In Wallonia and Brussels, civil society is very present in order to inform about far right, to unmask far right discourse and project, but also to physically protest. For instance, that new party called Chez Nous, that was found, as I said, last year, and quickly described as a far right party, met a very, very strong resistance by trade unions, by the so-called anti-fascist movements, and had to cancel its very first Congress. And since then, the party faces great difficulties to structure itself, even if it has received the support of these people I was talking about a few minutes ago. So this is a very important element to that mobilization of civil society. Fourth, it's a question of the media cordon sanitaire, of course, that applies specifically in the French-speaking part of Belgium, of course not in Flanders, that is highly formalized and mandatory in that part of the countries. This means that audiovisual media cannot receive far-right representatives in debate or live. The impact of such a cordon sanitaire has been analyzed by Léonie de Jong, for example, by myself for the Belgian case, very specifically and recently too. And yes, we can argue that the media cordon sanitaire impacts the development of far right in that part of the country because it reduces its visibility, but also because it keeps an idea of the devil in politics, if you know. Very quickly, fifth and finally, if nationalism is a key characteristic of far right, there is no strong sense of Walloon or Belgian identity contrary to the Flemish one in the north of the country. Thus, Walloon far-right parties face bigger difficulties to develop a coherent rhetoric on this issue. I've not noticed the cordon sanitaire in its political form because if that cordon sanitaire is highly formalized for over 30 years today, it's difficult to show, and that graphs I showed you a few minutes ago help us to explain that the political cordon sanitaire doesn't really affect the electoral development of far-right over time, but that elements should still be kept in mind. To conclude, maybe I still had some things to add, but we can come back during the discussion if you want, just to compare and to via that graphs to have a look on the strong paradox of the development of the far right in Belgium, but also to say that the situation in the French-speaking Belgium is not fixed. And I mean that the far right could still develop in the future in that part of the country. Let's think, and that's why I propose you a graph of the German situation over time since '65, where the AfD has developed very quickly since 2013. Another example, of course, is in Spain with Vox, with a long tradition of absence of marginality for far right in that country during several decades, and again for a few years now that far right party can develop. So I've quickly described far right in its electoral form. I wanted to add some reflections about the far right galaxy with other movements that are not really real political parties, but I leave it for the discussion if you want. I don't want to be too long. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and sorry to rush you. I just want to respect the others' time as well. And we already have a question. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions before we need to move on to the next presentation. So Fatih Brumesh, if you would like to ask.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you for the presentation. My question is about anti-immigration attitudes. You see, these people, right-wing politicians, well, right-wing parties are usually against different waves of migrants to their homeland, you see. So I'm aware, as a scholar on migration, I mean, I'm particularly interested in the different waves of migration, but I have a question about this anti-immigrant attitudes and neglecting the fact, I mean, those right-wing politicians or activists, or there is a real problem with migration, you see, the migration issue, because those who are against migration tend to forget about the benefits of these migrants. I mean, they are usually filling gaps. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. I'm particularly addressing the presenter, filling gaps that are not really or couldn't be filled by a native labor force, as simple as that. So they are what I think Winde called the 3D category jobs, dirty, dangerous, and downgraded. You see, because immigrants usually downgrade, whether they have degrees or you see university degrees, they would usually take jobs which are lower than their qualifications. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. I have recently learned that the British, who had serious problems with the different waves of migrants, particularly from Eastern Europeans, from Eastern Europe, because I worked on Eastern Europeans, the influx of Eastern Europeans to Britain. And of course, it escalated later to Brexit, of course, calling to end free mobility and so on. But I have read that, this morning, that people now, British people, well, I think 40-something percent, 45% of Britons like the government to ease or to be flexible about visas for those who like to come, you see, in order to fill gaps. So against migration, and then trying to get more people to fill gaps for you.
Could we please wrap up the question? Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
we have limited time.
Okay, thank you. How can you explain this? I mean, that is a dilemma, really. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your reflection and question. Just maybe quickly about anti-immigration attitudes in Belgium and maybe mostly in Flanders. The fact is that the Vlaams Belang one was first and foremost an independentist party before becoming a far-right party, I would say. Quickly, it adopted these anti-immigrants attitudes, but firstly, it was an independentist party. It's still the case today. One of the first goals of this party is to split, to divide the country and to gain the independence of Flanders. It's the very first thing, and so they developed not only anti-immigrants attitudes, but also anti-Walloon or anti-French speakers, I would say, attitudes inside the country too. It's maybe the third thing. The second is anti-immigration, but also anti-Islam more globally. May you be a foreigner or a Belgian as such. So it's the second position developed by Philip de Winter on the example of the Dutch PVV of Geert Wilders, notably. And maybe another point in order to come back to your reflection is that if we look, and it's very interesting about immigration, there is Antwerp, of course, where there is a large, how to say, immigration population, I would say just a few words. And yes, there is a strong far-right presence for several decades. It's one of the region where Vlaams Blok developed the first and the most importantly. But we can also have a look at Brussels. And in Brussels, we have a lot of immigration, but at the same time, there is no very significant far-right party. Even the Vlaams Belang, which is present in Brussels, with one member in the regional parliament, but only one member out of several dozens. But far-right parties struggle and have difficulties, I would say, to develop in Brussels. So we can see that tension between immigration and attitudes again or against or pro-immigration.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bia, for your answer, and also Mr. Boonmash for your question. Yeah, thank you for your time, and I think we'll move on to the next speaker. Yes, next up, I think it is Dr. Stewart.
Hello, do you hear me? Yes, hello, thank you for having me. I will be speaking on the populism in the Netherlands, and I have a PowerPoint that I will now try to share. I hope that works, because I see I cannot like make it the live things, some animations that I put in, but then it's not really necessary, I think. I will do it like this. So I will try to stick within the 15 minutes that I have. I will first start with the populism definition, because in my research, and well, there's always a lot of discussion about what populism is, and there's also a lot of confusion about the relationship between populism and the far right, which I will speak a little bit about, and how I use it in my analysis. And I have a bit of different analysis method that I developed in my PhD, and which I will briefly explain, because otherwise you cannot understand what I do at all. So, and after that, I will talk about populism in the Netherlands, and I will introduce you to some populist leaders and how they and how their discourse is, and reaction of some mainstream politicians. So first, a populism definition. I look at populism as a discourse style. And in this, I follow the definition of populism of Laclau. However, I differ a bit from his perspective, because I follow also the notion of Teun van Dijk's theory on discourse and ideology. And he describes that there are always three dimensions in discourse. That's the discourse, first the discourse structure, that's about ideas. Then you have discourse use, that's about presentation, it's rhetoric. And the third thing is the social dimension of discourse, and that's about social relations. And in those three dimensions of discourse, populism means something different, a little bit different from each other. And that's also the reason why there's always so much discussion about what populism is. And I managed to define populism in close relationship to elitism and pluralism. That means that it's a relative definition. So it's not something you can say, this is populist and this is not. No, it's always context dependent. Nothing is populist in itself, but you can sort of say this is more populist than it is elitist or pluralist. And how that works, to find out how it precisely works, I analyzed the language structure beneath political language. So all the ways the word populism is used. And then you can see that it hangs together very closely with elitism and pluralism, as you see in this schedule, that if you look at elitism here and populism, they always are seen as oppositions, but they also have something in common, and that's that they both look at people as one, and this can be seen as anti-pluralism, and it's this exactly the opposite of pluralism. And so this is one dimension of discourse. And in another dimension, that's the ideational dimension. But if you look at the social dimension, then it's mostly about elitism and anti-elitism. And anti-elitism is exactly what populism has in common with pluralism. So this is a bit confusion maybe for you now, but in a way, you can define populism very precisely in relationship to elitism and pluralism. And this schedule you cannot read, it's not necessary, because very in detail you can define on different elements of discourse how the three relate to each other and also their opposites. So that's basically you get 6 political styles, which you can very specifically look into discourse, how politicians relate to these styles. And that's what I did in my dissertation. And I analyzed a lot of politicians in the Netherlands, but also in the US and in the UK. And through those analysis, I could patternized that you can say that right-wing populists mostly combine populism with elitism, whereas left-wing populists mostly combine populism with pluralism. And on the other side of the political spectrum, you can see that center politics is a combination of elitism with pluralism. So all these styles hang together. And for this analysis of populism in the Netherlands, I didn't use all those specific parts, but you can sort of make it a bit less complicated by seeing it as 3 features. It's in the ideational realm, you look at politicians if they are seeing people as diverse or as one. In the social dimension, they are either part of the elite or the people, and in the presentational dimension, they present themselves as a voter or as a real politician. So this is the way I look at populism, and I really want to make a remark that in my research, every political style, so populism, elitism, and pluralism, has democratic and undemocratic expressions. And populism in itself is a necessary part of democracy, and it's a reaction to undemocratic expressions of other styles of pluralism and elitism. And it's important to see if something is extreme or far right, then it's more important to study the variance of populism and not so much to look at the difference between populism and other styles. Anyway, look at the Netherlands. The Netherlands is, as you might know, it has a multi-party system, and we always have coalition governments. So there's never one party governing, is always more. And that leads to a very old tradition we call polderen. That's, we always cooperate. And in the Netherlands, you have to cooperate because otherwise the dikes will break and we will not have any land left because there will be a very huge problem with floods. So basically in the DNA of the Dutch, it's that we cooperate. But today, that seems not very much the case anymore. There's very much fragmentation in politics and also polarization. So populism was not really in the tradition of Dutch politics. There was a small populist wave in the 70s, but you can basically say that was more pluralist than really populist. And in the 80s and 90s, there were two small populist parties on the left. One on the left, it was the Socialist Party, and one on the right, it was the Centrum Party. But it was really not very influential, really very marginal. But then since 2000, there is a second populist wave in the Netherlands, and that's here to stay. Everybody is sort of having consensus about that. And it started all with Pim Fortuyn, who was already mentioned in the introduction. And he really set the tone for the rest of the 21st century until now. He was murdered, unfortunately, but his heritage was taken over by Geert Wilders and later Thierry Baudet on the right, and the SP was also still there on the left. And more recently, this populist landscape has changed a little bit, because since the last elections in 2021, there are now many small populist parties or even populist politicians who act on their own. And the most salient of that is Caroline van der Plas of the Boer-Burgerbeweging. That's the farmers. It's a real new version of farmers populism. And she arrived, you can see it in the photograph beneath, in a tractor on the political in Parliament the first day she was elected, which was quite an entrance. And another one on the left, there is Sylvana Simons of Bijin. She is really an example of left-wing populism, more in the tradition of Black Lives Matter. Now, if you look at the development of populism in the last 10 years, as of 2012, you can see beneath, in 2012, we had in Parliament, you can say, 32 populist seats of different parties, on the left and on the right. That's about 21% of the seats. In 2017, that's 5 years later, it was 44 populist seats. It's 29% of the seats. And in the last elections, a year ago, it's about 42 populist seats. That's about 30%. And in the latest poll of a month ago, there were even 67 populist seats in the polls, which is already, it's of course not, if there would be elections, that would be less, because polls are always more extreme than the real elections. But nevertheless, this tells a lot, that the political landscape is really very, very volatile. And if you look at in my way of analyzing populism, you see on the upper left side, right side, you see the populist corner of the triangle. On the upper right side, the elitist triangle, and on the bottom, the pluralist. And you see the yellow dots, you see 4 pluralist political leaders, you see 4 elitist populist political leaders, and 5 populist political leaders. And of these populist political leaders, you can see that these on the left side, these are more left-wing populism. This is the right-wing populism, and Geert Wilders is seen as a full populist. That means he has very right-wing, and even you can say extreme right opinions and standpoints, but he also has left-wing standpoints. He combines that. And as I said, this analysis is not about the difference between extreme right and democratic and undemocratic forms of populism. It's just about populism. If you want to know more about what is within democratic boundaries or not, then you have to analyze more specifically and compare like the discourse of Thierry Baudet. I did it in an article that I wrote for the journal Populism. And then I compare, for instance, Thierry Baudet with Trump and with Johnson, and then you can see that he's really his really undemocratic tendencies. But this analysis is not about that. If you look at the 2021 elections in the Netherlands, that was in March, 1.5 years ago, you see that the political landscape is really scattered. We used to have already a lot of parties. Like in 2012, we had 13 parties. In 2017, there were more, I don't know. Then there were 13, but now we have 18. And when the elections were there, but now there has already been 2 more divisions. And so now at the moment we have 20 parties, or like parties or politicians that act on behalf of themselves. And here you can see that the amount of elitist political leaders is now 4, so a bit less. You see more people in the pluralist corner, but there's some interesting changes. You see, this is the leader of the Social Democrats, is the leader of the Green, and in 2012 their positions were on the other side. So, and this is more the left side, and this is more the center. So this is really fluctuating, but most saliently, you see that the populist corner is really overcrowded. There are so many populist politicians at the moment active in the Netherlands, not only on the right side, but mostly on the left and in full populism side. And there's one really interesting political player, that's Omtzigt. He is originally from the CDA, but he had a disagreement, and now he's on its own, and he's really floating around somewhere here. But he's not really populist, but he has some really also some very, very populist traits as well. So how many time? I think
you have 2 more minutes.
Okay, well,
I think you have 2 more minutes, yeah.
Well, just very briefly, you all know Geert Wilders. He's from the Partij van de Vrijheid. I won't say very much about him because I think you're really familiar with him. Then Thierry Baudet, this is a really strange person. He first came because he was anti-Ukraine referendum. And then he entered politics, and then he was anti-EU. And then when COVID started, he was also first saying that the government did do too little, and then it was too much. And now he's a very conspiracy theorist. He also said that from himself. So, and then the last one, this is really the real new development in the Netherlands. That is Caroline van der Plas from the Boerenburgerbeweging. She is now the voice of the people in the regions against the people in the cities, most saintly the people in The Hague, the city of politics. And she really dominates the debate at the moment. But also Sylvana Simons from Bijeen, she's really very, from the left side, a very strong populist voice. And already told you about Pieter Omtzigt. And I would say he's more not a real populist, but sort of driven into this populist discourse because of his disagreement with how politics is working at the moment. Now, to conclude, center politics in the Netherlands reacts in different ways. There's an anti-populist reaction, it's really fighting populism. And like our prime minister is more embracing populism. He says, I'm the good populist and the other ones are the bad populists. So vote for me. I'm a normal guy. I bike and I eat an apple. And I'm very, very, I'm not elite. But then again, mainstream politics is in the Netherlands really at the moment very uncertain. There's a lot of confusion. They try to adopt a criticism of the populist opposition, but they really have big problems in how to react. And that's my brief overview of Dutch.
Thank you so much for that very thorough overview of the Dutch political landscape. Even myself, having lived in the Netherlands for the past 4 years, I feel like I learned a lot on how the different views of how populist many parties actors are actually. I'm looking forward to the discussion. We'll be having that at the end of the next presentation as well, and take those questions together. So I'd like to invite Dr. Dolia to come to the stage, digital stage.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to this panel. I will very much speak about populist discourses in Switzerland, drawing from a research that I carried out together with Diana Ingenhoff from University of Freiburg in Switzerland and Annabella Bejum from University of Sibiu in Romania. And what I would like to say from the start is that we're not experts in populism, right? Our area of research, so we are media and communication scholars with a focus very much on public diplomacy and strategic communication. Now, I think it's important to clarify where we come from and how we work interdisciplinary and how we have come up to work on this idea, on this topic, actually, of populist discourses. Because basically the construction of country images and identities, the areas that we are, the topics that we are traditionally studying in public diplomacy, strategic communication, and nation branding, are traditionally studied in relation to practices of state and non-state actors. But what we are increasingly seeing is the instrumentalization of country images and identities in debates beyond such strategic promotional practices, such as debates on elections, referendums, and migration. So what we did was to analyze how the Swiss media constructed Switzerland's image and identity in the debate that followed the Stop Mass Immigration initiative, actually the referendum, sorry, from 2014. With this, we basically bridge streams of research on country images, identities, migration, and populism that haven't been integrated. We proposed a critical discourse analysis approach to identify specific discursive strategies, and we argue these are all the more needed as the literature on populism is very much driven by quantitative type of analysis and content analysis. And we highlighted the role of media in reproducing populist discourses on country images and identities. Of course, since you extended the invitation for me to join the panel, what I did was to put together in this presentation also some elements about to give a bit of context to this particular referendum, if you want, that we analyze. So I'll talk very briefly about Swiss People's Party and the history of most debated referendums on migration in Switzerland, again, just to give a bit of context. And then I'll focus on media's discourses in relation to the 2014 Stop Mass Immigration referendum, especially because, as several scholars highlighted, the role of media is one of the largest research gaps when it comes to the study of populism. So just to briefly outline some elements that are specific to Swiss People's Party. As Professor Betz already mentioned, this is not the only populist party in Switzerland. It was founded through the merger of small farmer parties in 1971. It was a rather small party, but since the 1990s, it has grown into the largest party in Switzerland, one of the strongest right-wing populist parties in Europe. And in terms of stances and positions, we see anti-immigration rhetoric, anti-EU rhetoric, a pro-rhetoric for the protection of the country's cultural identity, and of course, an anti-political elite type of discourse, which is very interesting because they are now part of the government. So they managed to balance the position of doing opposition from within the government. But what is very interesting about Switzerland is that its direct democracy seems to be favorable for the growing of populism. So it is argued that the direct democracy provides actually the ideal opportunity structure for the emergence of populist political communication, because all these initiatives that are put for referendums actually allow political players to push issues that resonate well with the people to the top of the political agenda. And the ideological cause of SVP, the Swiss People Party, and the Ticino League, the other populist party in Switzerland, are heavily influenced by a specific variant of populism, Alpine populism. Now, this is very interesting because it taps into people's attitudes, into the idealization of small-scale agriculture, the pure nature that stands in contrast to impure urban influences and industrial growth. It highlights the hard and honest work culture that leads the people living there to champion values such as civic mindedness, cleanness, order, and the strong identification with the local communities and a voluntary system of unpaid self-administration fuels the narrative of the honest locals who know best how to run their communities without basically interference. And this narrative can, of course, be tied not only with to the myths of independence, neutrality, Swiss exceptionalism, but also to the vision of special identity and fear of loss of home. These particular insights are very useful when we are looking at the different initiatives that the Swiss People Party has put forward. And of course, I've selected some of the most debated initiatives that were articulated around immigration. Now, before I look into those particular initiatives, I think it's important to kind of contextualize a bit the history of migration in Switzerland, because it isn't something that just happened now or towards the end of this century or the previous century and so on. It's important to highlight that the origins of migration in Switzerland are dating back to the times of industrialization, to the second half of the 19th century, when Switzerland became attractive for German and Italian migrants. The over-foreignization of Switzerland reached a peak between the 80s and the 1920s, when the number of Italian and German migrants nearly doubled. And it was basically the large railway projects like the Gotha Tunnel, for example, that attracted a high number of Mediterranean migrants to come to Switzerland. And for instance, to give you some data, so in the 1914, for instance, the foreign-born population of the total population stood up to 15%, or even reached 30% in Geneva and Basel. So if we now look at the most debated referendums on migration in Switzerland and connect these ideas, connect these with the attitudes of the Swiss people, as well as with the contextualize more in the term in the context of wider history of migration in Switzerland, now we might see why these initiatives were appealing to begin with for Swiss People Party and why they were appealing to the Swiss people. So, for instance, the first such initiative, the Schwarzenbach initiative from the 1970, was called Against Floods of Foreigners and Overpopulation. It was rejected, but even the terminology, so the linguistic choices of what the linguistic choices of words, floods, overpopulation, target exactly this idea that the country is, overcrowded. And this is an argument that comes back and again in the rhetoric of Swiss People Party. In 2007, an initiative that generated high debates was around the deportation of foreigners who commit serious crimes and welfare fraud. It was adopted. The reason it was so heavily debated, the reason that was so heavily debated was the use of the posters. Because the Swiss People Party used to illustrate the posters with three white sheep and a black sheep. And then there was another poster that portrayed veiled Muslim women with a very, with the message, "Where are we living? Baden or Baghdad?" This poster can't be found, so I tried to find this poster just to visualize a bit. There was also a video. They were forced to take the video down, but it kind of gives you a sense of the visual representation of the different initiatives. In 2009, it was the ban on the minaret, the minaret ban initiative, which was also adopted. Then it was the 2014 Stop Mass Immigration Initiative, stipulating the introduction of migration quota. That one was also adopted, and I'll talk more about this. In 2016, the Enforcement Initiative, and then that was rejected. And in 2020, the referendum on the Limitation Initiative, again, with the idea that there is an imminent disaster coming, and there is an overcrowdedness of the country. So again, both visually, but also through the strategic linguistic choices of these campaigns, we see how the idea of a pure Switzerland, a Switzerland that is cares for nature, cares for its pureness, is very much put forward. Now, to go to the case study on the Stop Mass Immigration referendum, what we wanted to analyze is how the Swiss media have discursively constructed the country image and the identity in the debate around the passing of the referendum. We looked at two main journals, NZZ and Le Temps, for a period of a month, which was the month exactly after the passing of the referendum. Our main argument is that actors are actually, that media are actually actors in populist political communication. They use their powerful position to grant visibility to different political actors and reproduce in their discourses certain conceptualization about the country's image and identity. Consequently, we argue media reproduces a populist ideology of dividing society into antagonist categories, in groups versus out groups, the people versus the others. I won't go into very much detail to talk about the methodology, but just to briefly outline. So we looked at the explicit content of media discourse, particularly topics, by operationalizing the country image model. And we looked at the functional dimension, the normative dimension, the aesthetic dimension, and the emotional dimension of Switzerland's country image. What we were interested in seeing on this explicit content analysis level was the frequency of reference to a certain dimension that would give us the dominant descriptor attributed to Switzerland. So basically, in this debate following the referendum, how was Switzerland constructed in media, more linked to how it functions as an institution, as a country, what is the normative dimension, the norms that govern Switzerland, the aesthetic dimension, aspects related to how beautiful the country is, or emotional dimension, aspects related to how the people in the country are. That was just the first basis of the analysis, the first stage of the analysis. In the second stage of the analysis, we looked at the implicit content of media discourse. We looked at particular strategies and topoi, working with the model of Ruth Wodak and her co-authors. Basically, we looked at how media constructs, reconstructs, and mobilizes different representations of Switzerland, with a focus on uncovering the dimension, the dynamics, the interactions, and the interplay between Switzerland's different levels of the country image. So to what extent the media talked more about how Switzerland is strategically promoted by the government. So how is the government promoting Switzerland, or if media talked more about national identity in this debate and the results of the referendum, how that impacted the national identity. So I'll quickly go through the findings. So in terms of consequences, media covered extensively the consequences of the vote, focusing on the normative and the identity level of the country image. Who are we? What defines us as Swiss? What are our Swiss values, principles, and norms? And this has overcome the discourse on economic and political consequences. That is the functional dimension, the rethink of the political system, losses for the economy of the Switzerland or Switzerland's position in relation to the EU. We also identify different types of discourses, an institutional type of discourse, an expert type of discourse, and a political populist type of discourse with their corresponding types of strategies. And also we identify the way media strategically use storytelling to give voice to the people, ordinary citizens, but representative and symbolic for a multicultural and diverse Switzerland. But overall, media used a dominant perpetuation strategies to construct and reproduce a threatened national image and identity, talking about le fin de la Suisse, so the end of Switzerland, about malaise, catastrophe, tsunami, crainte, incertitude, and so on. Therefore, we argue that what we are basically seeing is a type of populist discourses by and through the media on two different levels. One is the international level, when Switzerland is discussing the relation with the EU, how others see Switzerland as being positioned in an advantageous position versus an inferiority position, and a national level where media talked at length about the internal divides. So what is most interesting here is that basically media went from highlighting the debates about us versus them to more to a type of debate of us versus us. So Rosti-Graben versus Polenta-Graben, so the divide between the German part and the Italian part of the nation, the Swiss, the French Swiss versus the rest of the Swiss, oftentimes being the French Swiss being called citizens of second class, the Greeks of Switzerland. Another divide was along the lines of the Swiss who voted yes, the Swiss who voted no. And another layer was the historical layer. Blocher reinterpreting the very myth of unity of Switzerland around the establishment of Switzerland, insinuating that some Swiss have always wanted unity while others fought for independence. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really refreshing to have this linguistic and political communication perspective. So after we've wrapped up all the presentations, I was wondering whether I could ask Dr. Betts to the floor if you had any concluding remarks. And then we can head on to the last questions.
Concluding remarks. I mean, I've been dealing with this for 30 years, and it's kind of getting tiresome and pathetic because ultimately it's always the same kind of thing. I mean, that kind of notion of what is populism. I mean, I'm sorry, but we know what populism is. And, that you can come up with, millions of whatever thing, but ultimately, we know when we know a political party or a movement which uses populist kind of rhetoric, when you see it, it's kind of like pornography in the Supreme Court kind of thing in the United States at one point. I mean, I've gotten to the point where ultimately, I know what's really interesting is in all of this is the question of, emotions and resentment. There's just so much resentment, I mean, the thing is, when I wanted to ask the question, actually in the Belgian case, I mean, what about the resentment the Flemish have towards the Walloons? I was talking to a student of mine who is actually from Chiasso in Ticino. And I said, I mean, how do you explain that 40% of the people vote for the Lega dei Ticinesi? And he said, well, I mean, there's all the resentment against these Italians who on a daily basis come to Lugano to work there, and they're clogging up in all the streets. And you can't really, I mean, it's going to take you to go from Locarno to go to Lugano, it takes you 2 hours because all these motorini of these people from Varese are there, okay? But then at the same time, we also don't like these people up north. And I said, what is up north for you? And it's Bellinzona. That's what the government of Ticino is. You have this, whatever. I lived in Rome for 2 years at the time of the revolution, and actually talked to quite a number of people at the time of the Lega Nord. And I mean, the resentment they had against the Southerners, that was much more pronounced against the resentment they had towards foreigners. For them, all these terronias, they call them, and all these Sicilians and Calabrians and people from the Basilicata, I mean, that was the problem, because they in Milan basically get the social housing because they had 5 children, and a Milanese couple had only 1 child and they couldn't get into social housing. I heard the same thing in Munich, where the government basically, the city government basically made the whole thing more fair. And so they came up with criteria how social housing was distributed, and having children, the number of children was a determining factor. And young Bavarian couples couldn't get into social housing because they were all clogged up by Turks. And that created resentment, and a lot of people were resentful about that. The other day, there was an article in 20 Minutes in Switzerland. This is a free newspaper. And the thing was, Ukrainian refugees come here and they drive a BMW and they get 4,000 franken a month, but they don't have to sell their BMW because they are supposed to go back to create resentment. I'm German, I live in this country, but I as a Swiss don't get 4,000, and I don't have a BMW, but they get everything. We don't get nothing. Okay, I mean and this kind of resentment. I'm actually over the last couple of days, I did a lot of studies on 14th century Rome, where there was a populist. And you have exactly the same kind of resentments. You have the same kind of emotions which come up, the same grievances come up as you have now. You have them in late 19th century France and the Boulangism. You have it at the beginning of the 20th century in France with Poujadism. It's always the same kind of story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always this kind of notion. And there's another kind of thing which is very important in all of this, which I learned. And this is that a lot of people, independent of where they are, have a sense that politicians, first of all, they don't give a shit about them. They have nothing but this contempt for them. I mean, Hillary Clinton's kind of notion of the deplorables, you find them throughout history. There is an American professor from the University of in LSU, Louisiana State University, who wrote one about white trash in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's exactly like the way the British media treat the chaffs.
Yeah.
All these kind of, the same thing in German, we have names for these things. In Switzerland, we have names for these kind of things. It's very, the populism in very many ways, it's a very simple kind of thing. I mean, people who have a sense that everybody else is getting attention because they happen to be who knows what, that everybody gets, money and all this kind of stuff, and they are the last ones. In eastern part of Germany, they have done surveys in Saxony, where the AfD gets 30% of the vote. In Thüringen, which is the second big kind of thing of the AfD, in surveys, over 50% of the people on a yearly basis say they feel like second-class citizens in their own country. And then
Thank you for this point. This idea of the resentment and inequality between people has really come up throughout. Comes up through the literature throughout.
That is, when it boils down to it, that's the essence of a lot of these kind of things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Betts. I'm really apologizing about going over time, but I'd love to get to the questions in the chat as well. And the first question that was asked in the chat was by Anita, and it's directed towards Carola for her presentation. And it's about the comment about Mark Rutte that adopted the kind of populist critique. So she asks, does this mean that the government is more reactive than proactive when it comes to communication and policies? Can it lead to the mainstreaming of right/left-wing populism in the Netherlands?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what is happening and what had happened, that a lot of populist critique has been adopted by the government. You can see the difference in the discourse of populists in the 80s was, if you look at what they said then, that's now government policy. So that was like right-wing discourse, and now it's mainstream. So that has been very much that has happened. On the other hand, there has been a lot of disastrous policies in the Netherlands, that a lot of mistakes have been made, and a lot of righteous critique. We have they call it the toeslag affair, in which people have been really destroyed by the government because they made a little mistake in their filling in forms. They got money for their childcare, and then they had to pay everything back, but a lot more. So they really got into trouble. The children were taken away. It's awful. And then we have these people in Groningen, in the northern parts, where the gas is, where there's earthquakes, little earthquakes, and people don't feel safe. So there's a lot of problems with politics, and there's a lot of critique on that. And that's the Pieter Omtzigt, the person that's like center, not a real populist, but I think he's really the one who is addressing this. He's not really populist, but he's addressing these problems as well. And it's not that mainstream politics doesn't want to solve those, but they're really incapable. They really don't know what to do. So
Yeah.
that's a really serious problem at the moment in the Netherlands, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Scholl. I'd like to quickly touch on Martin's question for Dr. Dolea. He asks, does the SVP appeal solely to the German-speaking electorate, or have they tried to grow in their French and Italian-speaking cantons as well?
So at the time when we do the analysis, and I mean, traditionally SVP is appealing to the German electorate, and I mean, by looking at the type of discourse used in relation to the referendum and the way they described the Swiss French and the Swiss Italian, I think it's very unlikely that, at least at that time, to look to expand to other bases. I don't know, maybe Professor Betts knows more about this and the recent developments at the time of the analysis that we conducted. I think it was very, very clear that they were reaching to their traditional German Swiss base.
Thank you.
Can I
Sure,
say?
of course, yes.
The biggest gains the SVP did over the last 10 years was, for example, in Neuchâtel. They didn't exist there. They went from 0 to 25%. I live in the canton of Vaud, where they also didn't exist. Now they are in everywhere. They made big gains. I mean, for me, the most astonishing kind of thing, if you go to Geneva, there is an area in Geneva which is called Paquis. This is where all the prostitutes are. This is a high multicultural. In about 10 years ago, I mean, they went from nothing to 30%. In Valais, same thing. And a friend of mine who is actually a counselor in Chiasso, he told me the biggest competition in Ticino for the Lega Ticinese is the SVP. So yes, I mean, they have, and they do have actually people in the Swiss Romande and in Ticino, which have a national profile. I mean, Oskar Freisinger is the most pronounced one, but he's gone. Yes, I mean, they have, but they have done that in the Swiss Romande because they basically towed the line of Blocher in Zurich. That was the most important. And he gave them a lot of support and money and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. There's another question from ECPS that kind of touches on this similar topic, and they draw the comparison of Dr. Pierre stressing the difference in populism in Wallonia and Flanders. And I'm just going to read from here. I wonder if there exists a similar division in Switzerland. There are different linguistic regions in the country. How does this manifest in the demand and supply side of populism in the country? This is just directed towards Dr. Jolia, but if, Dr. Betts also has something to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, I can only speak about the analysis that we've done that, and I saw that there was another question about why we chose the two papers. We used the LexisNexis database at the time for key phrases, and these two papers were the ones with most coverage. And very interestingly, the French-speaking, so the Le Temps had more coverage, being a French type of speaking a French language newspaper. It was more, the format itself is more prone towards debate, covering more editorial pieces, whereas NZZ was more with shorter pieces and overall fewer number of articles compared to Le Temps. At the time, this linguistic divide, yes, it existed, as we highlighted with the different discourse strategies and particular topoi that were used. But I think for me personally, the initial comments that Professor Betts made around how each of the, the Swiss Populist Party, the Liga di Ticino, and the others movements that emerge are always appealing to this idea of the neighbor. So I think you might be best placed to develop on those points.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the thing is also that, one of the most disturbing kind of thing is how the NZZ and Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which is has a renommee, has moved to the populist right over the last couple of years. To the point where, in Switzerland, there's on the German side another thing which is called Weltwoche, which comes out on a weekly kind of basis. And increasingly, they're moving in that kind of direction. And now generally, I think that ultimately, when it comes down to it, yes, there are all these differences. Swiss Romand, they are considered to be more relaxed and whatnot. But when it comes down to it, again, going back to the resentments, I couldn't. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I got something in the mail, which was contre la racaille de Danmas, against the riffraffs from Annemasse. Annemasse is a city on the other side of Geneva, has a very interesting kind of thing because it's Catholic against Protestant Geneva. And racaille really is, and this kind of notion is they're coming here, and which to a certain degree is true, by the way, but they're coming here, they're taking our jobs and all of this kind of stuff. And there's just a lot of resentment. It has always a lot of resentment. At the same time, they depend on these people. And it's this tension which somebody mentioned, you depend on certain people, but you don't like them when it comes down to it. And by the way, and the French, of course, are considered to be arrogant. The Germans too. The SVP in Zurich a couple of years had big things in newspaper where they gegen die arroganten Deutschen, against the arrogant Germans. And of course, the Italians too are arrogant, because at one point, a right-wing government, Berlusconi basically, the Minister of Finance basically said, anybody who has money, black money in Lugano, if they return them, they don't have to pay taxes on these kind of things. And it really devastated Lugano. And my friend who is in Chiasso, which is a little town, further down towards he says, they at one point they had 16 banks, 2 of them survived. So, and they basically made the money from black money from Italy when it came down to it.
I see Dr. Dolea and Dr. Schor's hand raised. I was wondering if they had a comment about what you just mentioned.
Yes, I just wanted to develop a bit on what Professor Betts just said. It's from a different piece of research. So it highlights how important emotions and resentment are. So I've done lots of research here in the UK on Romanian diaspora, and also how that taps into, issues of national identity here in the UK and the struggles around national identity here in the UK, and the long tension existing between the different the different parts of the UK. This is one element, but then another interesting element is the fear of the other, right? So when we talk about the British in relation to foreigners, generally speaking. But I see increasingly more emotions playing a huge role in the civic and political participation of diaspora. I've done focus groups with Romanians here in the UK, and their own sense of abandonment, the in-betweenness, the fact that they don't feel accepted, the consequences of the repeated media campaigns here in the UK made them feel unwelcome. All these have come to play a huge role in their vote for a far-right party, the Alliance for the Union of Romanians, who is self-entitled as the party of diaspora, basically.
Yeah.
And this has led to a change into how the Romanian diaspora traditionally voted, because they used to vote for more democratic parties, and now there's a big change there. So that's the
this was highlighted. Sorry, this was highlighted in one of our previous sessions. It's a really interesting point. But yeah, thank you for connecting the 2 points. I'd like to maybe conclude with Dr. Scores and maybe question or comments just to round things off.
Yes, I'd like to react to Mr. Bentz that in his comment that we all know what populism is, and I think that's still important to stress that there's a difference between nativism and right extremism and populism, because of course the resentment thing, that's really what we feel is part of populism. But on the other hand, if you only stress that part of it, it's only one part of populism, and another part is a really positive energy that populism can generate, because not all political practices and not all political democracies are just. There's a lot of things going on that are not right, and a lot of populism and also a lot of resentment is just. Not all of them, and especially not the racist but you really have to be careful not to say that nativism is the same thing as populism, and that's what I really want to
there's nuance in these different types of populism, that there's nuance in the ways.
And there's really populism has a very dark side, but it also has a good side. And that's the same for elitism and pluralism. Even pluralism is sort of the standard. That's what we all want to do. But the dark side of pluralism is technocracy. Because if you want to deal with everything in a very just way, then you make systems. And if you have systems, then people get lost in the system. And you get a bureaucracy, technocracy. And then as a reaction, you can have populism, because they react to that. It's an emotion, and that's important to keep the whole democracy in balance. And that's just don't forget, populism has a dark side, but it also has a very corrective side to democracy that's going the wrong way.
Interesting. Thank you for your comment.
Just say something on that, because I think I agree absolutely with you. I did not mean to say here, I spent a lot of time reading, on the 1890s American populism. I spent a lot of time, for example, on Gaitan in Colombia, who got himself killed. But, he really if he had had become president, I mean, Colombia would have been a different kind of thing, and even Peron. You know, I mean, there's a lot of positive kind of sides to Peron, absolutely. You know, when it comes down to it, you know, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly on this kind of thing with you. Problem, not the problem, but the reality is always, and it resides in this kind of notion of populism is about the people. And the question is, who are the people?
Yeah.
Too often, and you see it even in American populism, even the most progressive kind of populism, when it comes to Asians, when it comes to the Chinese in the 1890s, suddenly the populists basically say, here, you know, I mean, everybody, whatever, except for the Chinese. Let's get rid of the Chinese. Let's put them out. Now, I have a personal stake in all of this because my wife happens to be Chinese. So I was very much interested in this kind of thing. But there's always kind of this tinge in populism, even the most progressive ones, that certain people kind of do not belong to the people. They are out, not. So as much as I agree with you, but ultimately, you know, I mean, it's a very complicated kind of thing. It's not for nothing. Peron basically was a great admirer of Mussolini, and Gaetan himself was also, he lived in Rome for a while, and he was also kind of taken by Mussolini. So
I think your comment that it is all very complicated is very correct, because this is why we're having these panel discussions, and this is why maybe the literature exists, so we can keep having these conversations and discuss the nuance and the difference in defining who is good and who is bad. And I guess it's this Manichaean view of populism that keeps us having this conversation. I'm sorry to have to cut you off, but I feel bad for people who had planned these 2 hours, and we're going a bit over time. I'd really like to thank you guys for participating in our discussion and for your work in general. I'd also like to remind everyone that we'll be having another session, panel discussion in 3 weeks' time on the 15th of December. This is a bit earlier than normal because we have, with the holiday season, we're moving it up a week. So mark your calendars. We'll be discussing the Baltic states and Belarus. So that will be Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Belarus. So please register and sign up on the ECPS website. And thank you so much for participating today, and have a nice rest of your evening, I believe.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.